he asked her out.
Yeah.
She said no.
Yeah.
And then what? Like,
No. So she said yes, but she stood him up.
What do you mean?
She didn't show up.
She didn't show. Oh.
And then he came and he met her again, and he said,
"Is this every Friday night?"
No. Just one time it happened. After this happened,
like, were they like? Is it just like in the town? Like
in Bucharest was a city, is the capital city.
Like no, but like how did they? It's such a big city. How
but
did
the
they
Jewish refugees hung out together in certain areas.
So there must have been like a little neighborhood,
right, where all the Jewish refugees.
And then after she didn't
show up, he goes ahead and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't make it. I got a letter from my brother who survived, and blah blah blah. You know, I heard that he survived, and I was very, I had to beat this person because they were, the telephone had started then, and they were making a call and blah blah blah. And I'm sorry, I couldn't make it. So, and because he didn't want to take no for an answer." So she said, she didn't admit that she didn't show up. She said, next time show up. So then my mother, so then they started dating seriously. And then my mother told my father that she wanted to cover her hair. And my father started crying because he wasn't religious for 3 years during the war at all. And he remembered that his mother died and that her mother covered her hair. As an observant woman.
So the last time he was related to someone who covered their hair
was his mother.
His mother
was killed in Auschwitz. So he started crying, and they decided to get engaged. Yitzchak Friedman, who was my father's distant cousin, like a third cousin. Martha Friedman's mother was a Hyman. She was like a second cousin to my father, and Avram Yitzchak Friedman and all his children, 4 children, survived Grosvedine or Cluj, and they came to Bucharest, and they sponsored the engagement party. In like November of 1944, in Bucharest, and my mother says that there was another guy that was after her. His name was Moshe Hassett. He lived in Flatbush. His children still live in Flatbush somewhere, and he was younger than Zaidi. And at their engagement party, they were dancing. It was obviously more modern. By the time, again, they started dancing, boys and girls, and he wanted to dance with her and take her out and elope with her, but she said no, she's engaged. Can you imagine going over to the bride, not the wedding bride, but to the thing? This guy Moshe Hass had a lot of guts. Well, later on they became friendly. They were friends, family friends. So they got engaged, and then they got married in February of 1945.
They got married in
February of 45. And they got married in Temeshvar. They both were orphans. They were both orphans. Don't forget, almost everybody was an orphan. Except for Avram Yitzchak Friedman, a few people that were their age, older, which were not as old. Like Toby's grandfather also survived, even though he acted like he was 50. So what happened was, they got married in February in Temeshvar, went back to Temeshvar to get married. He didn't have his siblings with him because Yidu was in a hospital and Gitto had just been liberated. And he didn't even know.
He didn't know.
Because it was January 27, 1945. He didn't know where his sister was. Right? He didn't know where his sister was. And his brother was in the hospital. So he didn't really have, and he had his cousins, the Friedmans and the Hymans. He had some cousins, some Hyman cousins, and these Friedmans. But the Frankels were all intact, and they were there in Temeshvar. So they got married in Temeshvar. My parents moved back to my father's hometown to Crasna. They go back to Crasna, and they find all the devastation. And they don't live in the father's house because that was a little bit out. The mother's house, that was a little bit out, but when they go back and there's the city is devastated. The Jewish community is devastated. There's hardly anybody Jews back that came back to Crasna in 1945. Many of their families are either went to the concentration camps, killed, or in different places in different parts of Europe. So there were a few families left in Crasna, and they were mostly men, because the girls either died. Most of the men survived because a lot of the men were in working camps or somehow survived, I guess. But a lot of the women were killed. And at one time, my mother told me that they had invited for Friday night Shabbat dinner, for Shabbos dinner Friday night. They invited the boys that were left over that survived. My mother was cooking, and there was 10 boys over Friday night. And what did they do? They were all crying because they had all lost their families. They lost their siblings, they lost their parents. They lost everything. They lost their lives.
The whole Friday night dinner was just crying?
Well, after that, they started drinking, and drinking led to crying. And one of the 10 boys, one of the guests that my father had over and my parents had over, started really crying really hard, and went into the kitchen, took a knife, and wanted to kill himself. And everybody, they couldn't. It was known there was even suicides after that, after the Holocaust survivors, and this was immediately after the Holocaust. This was later on in 1945. When everybody realized what the devastation was. He wanted to kill himself with a knife, and none of the guys could get to him, could talk to him. Every time they went near him, he became more violent and wanted to kill himself. The only person in the room there that was able to talk to him was my mother, because she talked to him softly and kindly, and she went over to him and softly and took the knife away, and they took the knife away from him and saved the guy's life. It turns out that this man later on became the president of the Jewish congregations in Antwerp, Belgium, and my mother saved him, and he has today, he's not alive today, but he has great children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. Belgium and Israel, who came to the United States, that was saved by my mother, actually.